America now functions as a plutocracy. It caters to a corporate ruling class that is legally able to buy the electoral process and funnel most of the wealth into the military and banking institutions. In a brilliant diatribe, George Carlin perfectly summarized much of the character of the American social structure. There is a long history of the people's struggle against these systems of power, which are now totally out of control in their wholesale ownership of society. While the dominant narrative recognizes some of the leaders of resistance movements throughout history, it usually does so through a lens of deep distortion and omission. We are taught to celebrate the life and teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. towards racial equality, but we are never informed that towards the end of his life, his major focus was achieving widespread social justice by combating the three evils of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism. King later planned to take the civil rights movement to yet another march on Washington, D.C., but unlike the event 4 years prior, which held his famous I Have a Dream speech, King would lead poor people of all races in the spring of 1968 to demand at least jobs or income for all. Or Helen Keller, whom we all learned was a blind and deaf girl who with great intrepidness overcame her disabilities to learn to read and write. However, the real reason Helen Keller was so famous in her time is that she was a radical reformer who saw the conditions such as blindness and deafness disproportionately affected the poor and working classes due to a lack of access to health care. Keller joined the U.S. Socialist Party in 1909 and the Industrial Workers of the World in 1912. She later said, "I, who had thought blindness a misfortune beyond human control, found that too much of it was traceable to wrong industrial conditions, often caused by the selfishness and greed of employers." While some of these figures have been bastardized and misappropriated by the establishment, there is another type of social dissident that is almost entirely absent from history in that role. I refer to our leaders, prominent individuals in the systems of power who have raised the alarms and sided with the public in the face of overwhelming vested interests. As George Carlin would say, people with access to the big club. Some of the very issues they railed against are still plaguing us to this day, and yet their voices have been muted, purged, and mostly erased from our collective memories. They, and we, are victims of the United States of amnesia.
One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers Brokerage, the Dominican Republic for sugar interests, Honduras for U.S. fruit companies and China for Standard Oil. General Butler's services were also in demand in the United States itself in the 1930s, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to relieve the misery of the Depression through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and misdeeds.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for. And so, in 1934, a group of conspirators sought to involve General Butler in a treasonous plan.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities, which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire.
The administration tried to sweep it under the carpet and keep it out of the public eye, and most major news organizations gave it minimal and mocking coverage. Similar to the lack of prosecution for war or banking criminals in the United States today, no one was held accountable. In the aftermath, Butler said, "Like most committees, it has slaughtered the little and allowed the big to escape." The big shots weren't even called to testify. They were all mentioned in the testimony. Why was all mention of these names suppressed from the testimony? It wasn't the end of Butler, however, who published a now famous treatise, War is a Racket, and spent the rest of his life trying to illuminate the inherently class-based criminal enterprise that constitutes most military involvements. The moneyed interests were correct to believe that Roosevelt envisioned changes for American society, far different from what they wished for. In the aftermath of World War II, most industrialized nations were rebuilt with fundamental changes made in government to ensure a more equitable society. Institutions such as universal health care, maternity leave, and the right to unionize are common in every developed country today, except for the United States. In 2014, the U.S. is the only nation without any federally guaranteed maternity leave. However, if Roosevelt had achieved his vision, America would also be among the first world in regards to these issues today.
7 years later, President Roosevelt was too sick to go up to the Capitol and give his annual State of the Union address.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
It has been my custom to deliver these annual messages in person.
So he gave it from the White House over the radio. When it was over, he asked the newsreel cameras to step into his room because he wanted the American people to see one particular part of his speech. The President of the United States then took the radical step of proposing a second Bill of Rights to the Constitution.
In our day, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station or race or creed. Among these are the right to a useful and remunerative job, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, the right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. The right to a good education. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. For unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world.
Roosevelt would be dead in little over a year. He would not live to see the end of the war, nor would there be any enactment of his new Bill of Rights. Had he lived and succeeded, every American, regardless of race, would have had a right to a decent job, a livable wage, universal health care, a good education, an affordable home, a paid vacation, and an adequate pension. None of this would come to pass. No American would be guaranteed any of this. But the people of Europe and Japan got every one of these rights. How did that happen? After the war, the people of Roosevelt's administration went overseas to help rebuild Europe. During this time, new constitutions were written for the defeated nations of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Italian Constitution guaranteed all women equal rights, and this was 1947. The German Constitution said that the state has the right to take over property and the means of production for the common good. And here's what we wrote up for the Japanese. All workers have a right to organize into a union, and academic freedom is guaranteed. For the next 65 years, we would not become the country that Roosevelt wanted us to be.
The United States currently spends close to $700 billion on its military, more than all other leading nations combined. Of its own discretionary budget, it allocates a whopping 58% to the armed forces, dwarfing anything spent on education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Surely this is no sane way to run a country, and it's not a recent development. On January 17, 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower gave the nation a dire warning about what he described as a threat to democratic government. He called it the military-industrial complex, a formidable union of defense contractors and the armed forces. Eisenhower, a retired five-star Army general, the man who led the Allies on D-Day, made the remarks in his farewell speech from the White House.
Of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
While unveiling radical plans like completely pulling out of Vietnam and abolishing the Federal Reserve banking system, John F. Kennedy publicly denounced the subversive manipulation of the country by powerful financial elites. 2 years before his assassination, delivering a powerful speech in New York on April 27, 1961, Kennedy called for an end to secret societies operating within the United States government.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control.
Delivered against a background of inflation, rising oil prices, and long gas lines, President Jimmy Carter delivered a speech, The Crisis of Confidence, that was derisively dubbed the Malaise speech by the press. It was an address in which he looked critically at himself and his own failures, but also warned Americans in dire, near-apocalyptic terms about the potential consequences of theirs.
What you see too often in Washington and elsewhere around the country is a system of government that seems incapable of action. You see a Congress twisted and pulled in every direction by hundreds of well-financed and powerful special interests. Too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but by what one owns. But we've discovered that owning things and consuming things does not satisfy our longing for meaning. We've learned that piling up material goods cannot fill the emptiness of lives which have no confidence or purpose. The symptoms of this crisis of the American spirit are all around us. Often you see paralysis and stagnation and drift. You don't like it, and neither do I. What can we do? We are at a turning point in our history. There are two paths to choose. One is the path I've warned about tonight, the path that leads to fragmentation and self-interest. Down that road lies a mistaken idea of freedom, the right to grasp for ourselves some advantage over others. That path would be one of constant conflict between narrow interest, ending in chaos and immobility. It is a certain route to failure.
In terms eerily similar to the dialogues of today, he called for a complete overhaul of energy systems and the greatest mobilization since World War II. A plan to move America into a future not dependent on oil, but utilizing sustainable energy for both the environment and our economy.
Beginning this moment, this nation will never use more foreign oil than we did in 1977. Now, from now on, every new addition to our demand for energy will be met through our own production and our own consumption. The generational growth in our dependence on foreign oil will be stopped dead in its tracks right now. As we move to the 1980s. For I am tonight setting the further goal of cutting our dependence on foreign oil by 1% by the end of the next decade. To give us a better security, I am asking for the most massive peacetime commitment of funds and resources in our nation's history to develop America's own alternative sources of fuel. Moreover, I will soon submit legislation to Congress calling for the creation of this nation's first solar bank, which will help us achieve the crucial goal of 20% of our energy coming from solar power by the year 2000. These efforts cost money, and that is why Congress must enact the windfall profits tax without delay. It will be money well spent, unlike the billions of dollars that we ship to foreign countries to pay for foreign oil. These funds will be paid by Americans to Americans. These funds will go to pay for the increase in inflation and unemployment. To further contribute to our proposal tonight, the next $10 billion over the next decade to strengthen our public transportation systems. It is time for us to join hands in America. Let us commit ourselves together to the rebirth of the American spirit, working together with a common faith. We cannot